Tonight we begin with a subject that is both scandalous and scholarly, a topic that has fueled centuries of myths, misunderstandings, and quiet fascination. We are venturing into the intimate, confusing, and occasionally downright bizarre world of medieval sex. It was an era defined by grand chivalry, heroic crusades, and towering cathedrals, but it was also a time of deeply suspicious herbal remedies and social rules that governed every aspect of private life. Foreplay in many instances meant asking politely and hoping that no one, not your children, your in-laws, or the family goat, was watching too closely. It was a world where passion and piety were in a constant, often awkward dance. Before you get too comfortable and settle in for this journey, I would like to extend a warm welcome. I invite you to take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel, but only if you genuinely enjoy the kind of historical deep dives we do here. It's your support that makes these explorations possible. I am also always fascinated to see the global community we've built, so please let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from, and what time it is in your part of the world. It's a wonderful reminder that history connects us all, no matter the distance or time zone. Now find a comfortable spot, perhaps dim the lights for ambiance, and maybe even turn on a fan to create that soft, contemplative background hum. We are about to peel back the layers of history, moving beyond the stereotypes of knights in shining armor and damsels in distress. We will look at the raw, human experiences that are often left out of the grand narratives. This is not just a story of kings and queens, but of peasants, merchants, monks, and wives, all navigating the complex landscape of desire, duty, and devotion in a world very different from our own. Our journey tonight will be a careful one, guided by historical records, theological texts, and the quiet whispers of the past. We will tackle the myths head-on, from the infamous chastity belt to the idea of universal repression. We will also uncover the surprising realities, the regulated brothels, the complex rules of consent, and the simple, enduring human need for connection that persisted despite every obstacle. So let's ease into tonight's exploration together, stepping back in time to understand what it truly meant to love, lust, and live in the Middle Ages. Let's begin our journey by shattering one of the most enduring and romanticized misconceptions about the medieval world. The intimate moments of the Middle Ages did not, as popular culture might suggest, unfold beneath luxurious silk sheets in grand, candle-lit chambers while a troubadour played a soft melody on a lute in the background. This cinematic vision, while appealing, is a fantasy largely reserved for modern historical dramas. The truth for the vast majority of people was far less glamorous, significantly more crowded, and infinitely more complicated. The setting was seldom a private boudoir designed for romantic encounters. For the common medieval peasant who made up the bulk of the population, reality was a small single-room dwelling. This cramped space was shared by the entire family, a multi-generational unit that often included children of all ages, aging relatives, and occasionally a few prized livestock. Imagine a home where the kitchen, the bedroom, and the stable were all essentially the same square footage, distinguished only by their respective smells. A couple of goats might be tethered in one corner, while a chicken, possessing strong opinions about personal space, roamed freely. Privacy, as we understand it today, was a concept that simply did not exist. If a married couple wished for a moment of intimacy, they had to become masters of creativity and opportunity. Timing was absolutely critical, as was the delicate art of managing volume. Ideally, any romantic endeavor depended heavily on whether the children were soundly asleep and preferably facing the opposite wall. Curtains, if they existed at all, were a rare luxury, often just a piece of rough-spun cloth hung to create a flimsy illusion of seclusion. Beds themselves were communal affairs, shared not just by the couple but often by their children as well, all huddled together on a mattress of straw for warmth. Even among the upper echelons of society, true privacy remained an elusive commodity. Servants might be asleep on pallets at the foot of their lord and lady's bed, or they might be standing dutifully in the corner, trained to pretend they noticed nothing at all. Many noble households, driven by legal or religious imperatives, kept meticulous records of bedroom arrangements, which is every bit as awkward as it sounds. Furthermore, travel did not improve the situation. Inns frequently offered shared beds, meaning total strangers might find themselves sleeping side by side for the night, making any prospect of affection even more complicated. In the medieval world, few institutions shaped the intimate lives of individuals more profoundly than the church. It wasn't just a spiritual guide, it was a pervasive force in law, society, and the very fabric of daily existence. And when it came to the subject of what went on behind closed doors, or, more accurately, behind those shared curtains, the church had a great deal to say. According to the dominant theological teachings of the era, physical intimacy within marriage had one singular primary function: procreation. The goal was to create more Christian souls. That was it. Pleasure, emotional bonding, or stress relief were not on the official agenda. This rigid perspective was not merely the subject of a Sunday sermon that one could listen to and then conveniently forget. Bishops, theologians, and confessors dedicated themselves to producing detailed instructions, or penitentials, that outlined precisely what was and was not acceptable in the marital bed, just in case anyone dared to improvise. These manuals left very little to the imagination. They dictated not only the purpose of the act, but also the acceptable positions, and even the appropriate mindset. The missionary position was heavily favored, not just for its perceived symbolism, but because it was deemed the most natural, and therefore, the least likely to offend God. One influential 13th century theological guide for married couples offered a particularly joyless checklist for their intimate lives. It suggested that couples should engage in their marital duty without pleasure, without sin, and without delay. This framework effectively stripped the act of any joy, reducing it to a mechanical, almost reluctant obligation. Expressions of genuine affection were deemed acceptable, but only in moderation. Overt displays of passion, enthusiasm, or what might be considered excessive enjoyment were, to put it mildly, frowned upon. Such feelings were seen as a distraction from one's spiritual duties, a concession to the flesh rather than the soul. This detailed ecclesiastical oversight extended directly into the sacrament of confession. Priests were often instructed to ask pointed and sometimes uncomfortably specific questions to determine whether couples had strayed from these moral or ecclesiastical guidelines. These were not vague spiritual inquiries about one's general state of grace. They were direct interrogations about bedroom conduct. As a result, the average 14th century friar likely knew far more about the intimate habits of his parishioners than he did about their birthdays. The church's rulebook for romance was thick, detailed, and left very little room for personal interpretation or spontaneous passion. Let's delve deeper into the physical reality of medieval life, which directly shaped how people experienced love and intimacy. Forget the grand, stone-walled castles you see in films. For the vast majority, home was a humble and crowded affair. The typical peasant family lived in a wattle and daub hut, often consisting of just one single multi-purpose room. This space was the heart of their world, serving as the kitchen, the dining hall, the living area, and, most importantly for our story, the bedroom. It was a place teeming with life, noise, and a distinct lack of personal boundaries that we now take for granted. Imagine trying to find a moment of privacy in such a setting. The room would be filled with the entire family unit, which often spanned 3 generations. Children slept alongside their parents, grandparents might have a corner near the hearth, and unmarried siblings were part of the mix too. But the occupants were not limited to human family members. To protect them from theft or the elements, valuable livestock were frequently brought inside at night. A couple seeking intimacy might have to contend with the quiet munching of a goat, the soft clucking of chickens, or the heavy breathing of the family pig. This lack of separation between human and animal, private and public, was the norm. The floor was often packed earth, covered with stray rushes that absorbed spills, mud, and anything else that happened to fall. The air would be thick with the smell of wood smoke from the central fire, cooking food, unwashed bodies, and the nearby animals. In this environment, the very idea of a romantic secluded encounter was almost laughably out of reach. Intimacy was not an escape from daily life. It was something that had to be squeezed into the brief, quiet moments that daily life occasionally allowed. These conditions forced couples to become incredibly resourceful and pragmatic. They learned to operate with discretion, relying on the cover of darkness and the heavy sleep of their relatives. The rustling of a straw mattress, a whispered word, or a shared glance across a sleeping child was the language of their affection. It was a love lived not in a bubble of romantic isolation, but in the very thick of family existence. The one-room home was a constant reminder that in the medieval world, one's private life was, in many ways, a public performance, played out before an audience of family, neighbors, and livestock. The centerpiece of the medieval home, the bed, was far from the private sanctuary we consider it today. It was a communal piece of furniture, a hub of family life where boundaries were blurred by necessity and tradition. For a peasant family, the bed was typically a large wooden frame filled with a sack of straw, hay, or, for the slightly more affluent, feathers. This mattress, known as a paillasse, was not just for the married couple. It was often shared by the entire family, who would pile in together for warmth, especially during the cold winter months. Children, parents, and sometimes even grandparents would sleep side by side. This practice of co-sleeping fundamentally altered the nature of marital intimacy. A couple's private moments were never truly private. They were conducted in the quiet presence of their sleeping children, a reality that demanded a high degree of subtlety and self-control. The thin walls of the hut and the even thinner separation of a shared blanket meant that every sound and movement could be noticed. This constant proximity to others meant that romance had to be a silent, almost secretive affair. It was an act of connection carved out from the communal space, a whispered secret in a room full of listeners. The very concept of a marital bed as a space exclusively for a husband and wife was a luxury few could afford. Even when a couple had a bed to themselves, it was likely situated just feet away from where others slept on the floor. The flimsy curtains that sometimes surrounded a bed in a wealthier household offered more of a visual screen than an acoustic one. They created an illusion of solitude, a symbolic rather than a practical form of privacy. Everyone in the household would have been acutely aware of what was happening within that small enclosed space, even if they politely pretended otherwise. This environment fostered a different understanding of personal space and intimacy. It was less about grand passion and more about quiet companionship and shared warmth. The bed was a place of rest, of family, and of survival against the cold. Any intimacy that occurred there was woven into this fabric of communal living. It required a deep understanding between partners, a nonverbal communication that could navigate the challenges of their crowded world. The communal bed stands as a powerful symbol of how medieval life intertwined the public and the private, forcing love to adapt to the realities of a shared existence. Living in such close quarters meant that all senses were constantly engaged, and not always in a pleasant way. The medieval world was a loud and fragrant place, and the home was a microcosm of this reality. Thin wattle and daub walls did little to muffle sounds from either inside or outside the hut. A couple's whispers had to compete with the snoring of a relative, the cry of a baby, or the nightly sounds of the village. The barking of a dog, the lowing of a cow, or the late-night arguments of a neighbor were all part of the domestic soundscape, leaving little room for the quiet intimacy of lovers. Gossip, the currency of small communities, traveled faster than any plague. A raised voice or a suspicious noise in the night could become the subject of village chatter by morning. This constant social surveillance acted as a powerful regulator of behavior. Couples had to be masters of discretion, learning to communicate their desires without words, and to conduct their private lives in near silence. This necessity likely shaped the very nature of their affection, turning it into something more subtle, more restrained, and perhaps more reliant on gentle touch and quiet gestures than on passionate declarations. Then there were the smells. As we've touched upon, the single-room home was an assault on the nostrils by modern standards. The aroma of wood smoke, unwashed bodies, stored food and animals mingled in the air, creating a potent and inescapable scent profile. In this context, the personal scent of a partner was just one more layer in a complex tapestry of smells. Perfumes were an unimaginable luxury for the peasantry, and hygiene was a matter of practicality, not romance. The raw, earthy smell of another human being was simply part of the intimate experience, unfiltered and unmasked by artificial fragrances. This sensory overload meant that finding a moment of pure, uninterrupted connection was a rare and precious thing. It required a conscious effort to tune out the surrounding world, to focus solely on one another despite the distractions. Perhaps this is why love and affection in these circumstances were so resilient. They were not built on an idealized fantasy of romantic perfection. They were forged in the messy, noisy, smelly reality of everyday life. It was a love that had to be practical, patient, and profoundly understanding of the world in which it existed. One might assume that the wealthy and powerful nobles of the Middle Ages enjoyed a greater degree of privacy, but this was often not the case. While they had larger homes with multiple rooms, their lives were even more public in certain respects. A noble household was a bustling center of activity, filled not only with family but also with a large retinue of servants, attendants, chaplains, and courtiers. The lord and lady were constantly on display, their every action observed and noted. Their private chambers were not private sanctuaries but semi-public spaces where business was conducted and status was performed. The noble bedroom, or solar, was often a place of audience and administration. It was not unusual for a lord to receive visitors or dictate letters from his bed. At night the room was rarely empty. Trusted servants, such as a lady's maid or a lord's valet, would often sleep on simple truckle beds or pallets at the foot of their master's grand four-poster bed. Their presence was a matter of security, convenience, and status. It meant that even in their most intimate moments, a noble couple was likely not alone. They were surrounded by staff trained in the art of being invisible, of seeing and hearing nothing. This constant surveillance was compounded by a spiritual watchfulness. The upper classes were more directly exposed to the church's teachings on morality and sin. A personal chaplain or confessor was a standard part of any major household, and their role was to guide the spiritual lives of the family, including their marital conduct. This meant that a noble couple was not only being watched by their servants but was also being judged by God, with their priest acting as a very present intermediary. The pressure to conform to religious ideals of moderation and procreative purpose was immense. As a result, intimacy for the nobility was often a formal, almost ritualized affair. It was another duty to be performed, one that carried the weight of dynastic succession and spiritual obligation. While genuine affection certainly existed, it had to navigate a complex web of social and religious expectations. The grand, curtained bed of a noble was less a space of passionate escape, and more a stage upon which the roles of husband and wife, lord and lady were enacted. Privacy was a performance, and solitude was the rarest of luxuries, even for those who seemingly had everything. Life in the Middle Ages was not static. People traveled for trade, pilgrimage, or warfare, and this mobility introduced a whole new set of challenges for intimacy. If finding privacy at home was difficult, finding it on the road was nearly impossible. The medieval inn was not a place of private rooms and personal comfort. It was, honestly, a purely functional establishment designed to offer shelter and a meal to as many paying customers as possible. The most common arrangement was a large common room where travelers would eat, drink, and eventually sleep, often on the floor or on benches. For those who could afford a bed, the situation was not much more private. The Great Bed of Ware, a famous Elizabethan-era bed now in a museum, could supposedly sleep 4 couples at once. While that's an extreme example, it really illustrates a common practice. Beds in inns were often shared. Travelers would pay for a spot in a bed, not for the entire bed itself. This meant a married couple might find themselves sharing their sleeping space with complete strangers. A merchant, a pilgrim, or a soldier, all huddled together for warmth and security under a single set of blankets. Imagine the complexities this introduced. A couple on a journey, finally away from their crowded home and watchful family, would find themselves in an even more public sleeping arrangement. Any hope for a moment of affection had to be weighed against the presence of strangers just inches away. This made intimacy on the road a risky and highly inadvisable proposition. The social codes of the time, combined with the sheer lack of opportunity, meant that for most traveling couples, their journey was a period of enforced celibacy, a temporary pause in their marital life. This reality of travel highlights the pervasive lack of privacy across all aspects of medieval society. The modern expectation of having a personal, lockable space was entirely foreign. Whether at home, in a peasant hut, in a noble's chamber, or on the road in a crowded inn, life was lived collectively. People were rarely truly alone. This constant, unavoidable proximity to others shaped everything from social etiquette to personal relationships. It really underscores that loving in the Middle Ages was an act that was always, in some sense, public, requiring a level of discretion and adaptability that is honestly hard for us to fully comprehend today. In the medieval world, few things shaped private life more powerfully than the church, and it had a lot to say about what went on behind closed doors, or, more accurately, behind shared curtains. According to the most influential church teachings, physical intimacy had one primary, divinely sanctioned function: making more people. The purpose of marital relations was to be fruitful and multiply, filling the world with good Christian souls who would one day populate heaven. That was it. The act was a duty, a sacred obligation tied to the sacrament of marriage. Everything else, such as pleasure, emotional bonding, or simple stress relief, was considered secondary at best, and dangerously sinful at worst. This wasn't just a vague spiritual guideline whispered during a Sunday sermon. It was a core doctrine that bishops, theologians, and confessors painstakingly detailed in writing. They produced extensive manuals known as penitentials, which served as guidebooks for priests on how to regulate the moral lives of their flock. These texts laid out what was and was not acceptable in the marital bed, leaving very little room for personal interpretation or, heaven forbid, improvisation. The Church's view was clear: the body's desires were a potential gateway to sin, and they needed to be managed with the same rigor as one's finances or livestock, perhaps even more so. This focus on procreation above all else colored the entire perception of marital intimacy. The act itself was seen as a necessary concession to human weakness, a remedy for the sin of lust that could otherwise lead people astray. St. Augustine, one of the most influential thinkers of the early medieval period, argued that even within marriage, lust was a regrettable consequence of original sin. Therefore, the only way to engage in the act without committing a sin was to do so with the sole intention of conceiving a child. Any other motivation tainted the act, turning what could be a virtuous duty into a moment of indulgence. This perspective created a strange paradox for married couples. They were bound by holy matrimony and expected to produce heirs, yet they were simultaneously taught to be suspicious of the very desires that made this possible. The ideal was to approach one another with a sense of solemn duty rather than joyful passion. The Church effectively positioned itself as an invisible and very judgmental third party in every marriage bed across Christendom. Its rules were designed to keep the soul focused on the next life, even when the body was very much preoccupied with the earthly business of this one. If you think modern couples have trouble syncing their schedules, spare a thought for medieval folks. Planning a romantic evening in the Middle Ages required more than just a willing partner. It required a calendar, a priest's blessing, and the luck of a saint. The Church didn't just have opinions on why a couple should be intimate, it had strict prohibitions on when. Certain days of the week were absolutely off limits. Sundays were the Lord's Day, a time for prayer and rest, not carnal activity. Fridays were a day of penance in memory of the crucifixion, so that was also out. Wednesdays were often designated as another day of abstinence in many regions, just to be safe. But the restrictions didn't stop with the weekly schedule. The entire liturgical calendar was a divine obstacle course for married couples. Major holy seasons were strictly forbidden territory. Want to be close to your spouse during Lent? Think again. That was a full 40 days of penitence and fasting. The season of Advent leading up to Christmas was another 40-day period of spiritual preparation and abstinence. Add to that the vigils before major feast days, like Pentecost or Easter, and various holy days celebrating important saints. Suddenly, the year started to look less like a calendar, and more like a minefield of sin. Some confession manuals and local church councils took it even further, creating actual lists of forbidden days that could account for nearly half the year. These prohibitions could also extend to a woman's personal cycle. Intimacy was forbidden during menstruation, pregnancy, and for a period of 40 days after childbirth. The idea behind this complex web of rules was to subordinate physical life to the spiritual calendar. The body's rhythms were expected to yield to the Church's rhythms. The goal was to keep the soul pure and focused on heaven, even when earthly instincts had other ideas. For the average person, keeping track of this ever-shifting schedule of allowed and disallowed days must have been bewildering. You might be in the mood on a Tuesday in April, only to remember it was the feast day of St. George, a particularly revered saint you wouldn't want to offend. The result was that intimacy had to be planned with the same care one might use for planting crops, and with constant awareness of the religious calendar. A spontaneous moment of affection could, if timed incorrectly, lead to a heavy burden of spiritual guilt and an extra awkward trip to the confessional. The Church's rules were not merely suggestions, they were enforced through one of the most powerful tools at its disposal, the sacrament of confession. This was not a place for vague spiritual reflection, it was a forum for detailed moral examination, and priests were trained to ask very specific questions to root out sin in all its forms. When it came to marital life, these questions could become intensely personal, crossing a line that we would consider deeply private today. The confessor's job was to investigate whether a couple had violated any of the Church's numerous guidelines regarding their intimate lives. Priests, guided by their penitential manuals, would often ask pointed questions during confession. They might inquire about the frequency of marital relations, the days on which they occurred, and even the positions used. The goal was to determine if the couple had been too lustful, engaged in unnatural acts, or had relations on a forbidden day. Imagine the sheer awkwardness of having to describe your bedroom habits to your local priest, a man you saw every week and who held the keys to your eternal salvation. The potential for shame and embarrassment was immense, creating a powerful incentive to follow the rules. These confessionals served as a form of moral surveillance, a direct line from the church's high-minded theology into the most private corners of a person's life. Let's just say the average 14th century friar probably knew far more about his parishioners' intimate activities than he did about their family histories or birthdays. The questions were designed to leave no stone unturned. Some manuals even provided scripts for priests with escalating inquiries to uncover any hidden transgressions. This created a system where people were not just judged by God in the abstract, but were held accountable by his representative on earth in excruciating detail. This process, sometimes called the bedroom inquisition by modern historians, had a profound psychological impact. It reinforced the idea that sex, even within marriage, was inherently dangerous and fraught with spiritual peril. Every act of intimacy was shadowed by the possibility of sin and the eventual need to confess it. It encouraged a mindset of caution and restraint, where passion was viewed with suspicion. The ever-present threat of having to recount one's actions to a priest was a formidable tool for ensuring that the church's holy rules were not easily forgotten or ignored. While the church's rules were intended to be universal, their application in real life was far from uniform. The enforcement of these strict regulations often depended heavily on one's social class. The upper classes, the nobility and wealthy merchants, were far more exposed to this intense scrutiny. They had personal chaplains, confessors, and spiritual advisors who were a constant presence in their households. These priests were tasked with ensuring the spiritual well-being of the family, which meant they were breathing down the necks of the Lord and Lady, reminding them of every forbidden day and every theological nuance. For the nobility, marriage was intrinsically linked to politics, inheritance, and alliances. Producing a legitimate heir was a matter of state, not just personal desire. This meant their marital lives were already under immense pressure, and the church's rules added another heavy layer of obligation. A noble couple's failure to adhere to the rules could be seen as a spiritual failing that reflected on their entire dynasty. One 13th century bishop famously scolded a married couple of high standing for their excessive affection, which he defined as being intimate more than once a month. He sternly recommended they redirect their passion toward prayer. The couple was reportedly not thrilled. In stark contrast, the peasants, who made up the vast majority of the population, often had a more flexible and pragmatic approach. Their lives revolved around the brutal realities of agriculture, weather, and basic survival. They were more concerned with getting the harvest in than with remembering if it was the vigil of a minor saint. While they were certainly pious, the finer points of theological doctrine were often a distant concern. Their local parish priest might be less educated and less inclined to conduct a detailed bedroom inquisition, focusing instead on more public sins. This is not to say that peasants simply ignored the church. They attended mass and went to confession. But in the privacy of their one-room homes, many likely smiled, nodded at the priest's warnings, and then simply did what they were going to do anyway, just more quietly. Their lives were governed by the seasons of the earth more than the seasons of the liturgy. The need for human comfort and connection after a long day of backbreaking labor often outweighed the fear of committing a minor spiritual infraction. For the peasantry, the church's rules were a guide, but survival and human nature were often the final authority. The church's regulation of marital life went beyond just the timing and purpose of intimacy. It extended to the very emotions involved. In the eyes of many influential theologians, passion itself was a problem. One of the most peculiar and frankly joyless ideas was that a married couple should engage in their marital duty without excessive pleasure. One 13th century guide, as we've noted, explicitly instructed couples to approach the act without pleasure, without sin, and without delay. This is a checklist that seems designed to drain every last drop of joy from the experience, reducing it to a mechanical and somber obligation. The preferred method for intimacy was, unsurprisingly, the missionary position. This was not just a matter of tradition, it was laden with theological meaning. It was deemed the most natural position, the one used by animals for procreation, and therefore the least likely to be driven by lust. Any deviation from this was considered suspect, a sign that the couple was seeking pleasure for its own sake, rather than dutifully attempting to conceive a child. Other positions were often labeled as unnatural or sodomitical in penitential manuals, carrying heavy penances if confessed. Even simple enthusiasm could be considered a sin. This suspicion of pleasure came from a deep-seated belief that the flesh was weak and constantly at war with the spirit. To enjoy a physical act too much was to give in to the baser part of human nature, a step away from God and toward temptation. Saint Jerome, a highly influential church father, went so far as to state that he who loves his own wife too ardently is an adulterer. This shocking statement highlights the extreme view that even within the sanctified bonds of marriage, desire was a dangerous force that needed to be tamed, controlled, and ideally, minimized. Of course, we must wonder how many people actually lived this way. It is one thing for a celibate monk to write about the ideal of passionless procreation from the quiet of his scriptorium. It is quite another for a married couple, living in the messy, challenging, and emotional reality of daily life, to adhere to such a standard. While the truly devout may have strived for this level of asceticism, it is likely that most people found a way to reconcile their faith with their feelings. They may have confessed their excessive affection, done their penance, and then gone home to love their spouses with all the passion and enthusiasm that human nature demands. In medieval Europe, romance as we imagine it, a journey of falling in love followed by a heartfelt proposal, was largely a work of fiction. For most people, the path to the altar was less about following one's heart and more about following a carefully negotiated contract. If you were hoping for candlelit dinners, spontaneous poetry, and whispered confessions of undying love, you would be far better off reading a troubadour's ballad. Real-life marriage, particularly for the upper and middle classes, was primarily a business deal. It was an institution designed to consolidate wealth, forge alliances, and ensure social stability, with personal affection being a desirable but entirely optional extra. The language of marriage was the language of assets, property, and strategic advantage. Daughters were valuable commodities exchanged between families to cement political alliances, acquire new lands, or secure peace between neighbors who had previously disagreed over whose pig had eaten whose cabbage. A bride's value was often quantified in her dowry, a payment of coin, land, livestock, or fine linens that she brought to the marriage. In return, the groom's family might offer a dower, a portion of his property designated for her support if she were widowed. It was a transaction, a merger of two family enterprises where love was not listed on the balance sheet. This pragmatic approach trickled down even to the peasantry, though on a much smaller scale. While peasants had more freedom to choose their partners than nobles did, practical concerns still reigned supreme. A man's suitability as a husband was not judged by the quality of his sonnets but by the size of his ox, the condition of his tools, and the amount of land he stood to inherit. Similarly, a woman was evaluated on her practical skills, her ability to manage a household, spin wool, brew ale, and crucially, her reputation for hard work and a peaceable nature. Love might grow, but it had to be planted in fertile economic soil. This doesn't mean that love and affection were entirely absent from medieval marriages. They certainly existed, but they were often expected to develop after the wedding, not before. Affection was a bonus, a fortunate outcome of a well-made match, rather than a prerequisite for making one in the first place. Think of it less as the foundation of the relationship and more as a pleasant addition, like finding an extra coin in your pocket. As one medieval proverb more or less stated, better a wealthy match with a grumpy face than a poor one with dimples. It was a sentiment that was, if not romantic, at least brutally honest about the priorities of the age. Given that marriage was such a serious and strategic affair, it is no surprise that the process of courtship, when it occurred, was a highly controlled and supervised event. Young people, especially young women of any social standing, were rarely left to their own devices. The idea of a young couple dating in the modern sense would have been scandalous. Any interaction between a prospective bride and groom was carefully stage-managed by their families, who had a vested interest in ensuring that nothing went awry before the contracts were signed and the dowry was paid. The path to matrimony was a chaperoned one. A young maiden of a noble or merchant family would be perpetually watched over by her mother, a stern aunt, a governess, or, if the stakes were particularly high, an entire retinue of attendants. These chaperones were not there simply to make polite conversation. They were there to act as moral and social guardians, ensuring that no unapproved words, glances, or heaven forbid, touches were exchanged. Conversations were formal and public, often taking place during a family meal or in a crowded hall. The couple might be allowed a brief supervised walk in a garden, but they would never be out of earshot or eyesight of their ever-vigilant minders. Among the nobility, arranged matches were the absolute norm, often between individuals who had never met. Kings and lords negotiated the marriages of their children like strategic chess moves, using them to seal treaties, end feuds, or expand their territory. A princess might be betrothed as a child to a foreign prince she would not meet until her wedding day. In these cases, courtship was non-existent. The affection was something to be developed later, a practical skill to be learned alongside managing a new household and a new language. The expectation was one of duty and compliance, not romantic anticipation. Despite these heavy restrictions, human nature still found ways to operate. Where there is a will, there is almost always a workaround. Secret flirtations, the exchange of small hidden gifts, playful songs with double meanings, and moonlit walks to the village well became the unsanctioned side quests of medieval dating. These moments of stolen intimacy were thrilling but incredibly risky. If a young couple were caught kissing behind the barn, the consequences could be severe, ranging from public penance and a hefty fine to a ruined reputation and a very disappointed father armed with a pitchfork and a righteous sense of fury. Let's take a moment to clear up one of the most persistent, clunky, and frankly uncomfortable legends about medieval relationships: the chastity belt. Yes, you have almost certainly seen them in satirical cartoons, historical dramas, or the more unfortunate sections of museum gift shops. These fearsome iron contraptions, complete with padlocks and sharp-looking edges, were allegedly locked around a woman's waist by her husband before he rode off to war or on a long journey. The device was meant to be a foolproof method of ensuring her fidelity, leaving her physically and morally sealed until his return. It's a powerful image, but it's almost entirely a myth. There is virtually no solid, credible historical evidence to suggest that chastity belts were ever a widely used item during the Middle Ages. In fact, the vast majority of surviving examples that we have in museums today have been dated to the Renaissance or, even later, to the Victorian era. These later periods were far more obsessed with the idea of medieval repression than with the historical reality. Many of these belts were created not as functional devices but as joke items for Renaissance curiosity cabinets, as satirical illustrations, or as warnings against infidelity. They were symbols, not everyday medieval underwear. Medieval manuscripts, which are often filled with all sorts of bizarre and uncomfortable details about daily life, are suspiciously silent on the topic of mass-produced chastity belts. No legal codes regulated their use, no tailors' guild advertised custom fittings, and no church records show priests handing them out during pre-crusade marriage ceremonies. It is almost as if, and stay with me here, they were not actually a thing. This makes perfect sense from a practical standpoint. The design is wildly unhygienic. Medieval sanitation was already questionable. Now imagine adding a rusty, unventilated metal contraption with a lock that probably required a blacksmith to open. It would have caused more infections than it prevented indiscretions. So, where did this powerful myth originate? It likely stems from a combination of later moral panic and biting satire. Renaissance moralists and later Victorian collectors loved the image of the repressed, over-controlled medieval woman. It fit perfectly with their narrative of the Dark Ages as a time of barbarism and ignorance, from which they had thankfully emerged. Nothing says unenlightened quite like a literal keyhole in your underpants. The chastity belt was a fiction that served a purpose, a lurid fantasy that told people more about the anxieties of their own time than about the realities of the medieval past. If chastity belts were not the preferred method for ensuring a wife's fidelity, what was? Well, the reality was far more effective and honestly much cheaper than a custom-forged iron undergarment. In the medieval world, faithfulness was enforced through a powerful and ever-present combination of social pressure, constant surveillance, religious doctrine, and strategic matchmaking. These intangible forces were far more difficult to escape than any physical lock. In a world where everyone knew everyone else's business, a person's reputation was their most valuable asset, and the fear of losing it was a potent deterrent. For women of the nobility, life was lived under constant watch. A high-born lady was rarely, if ever, alone. She was surrounded by a retinue of ladies-in-waiting, servants, and chaperones whose job was not only to serve her but also to observe her. Her movements were tracked, her visitors were noted, and her behavior was scrutinized. This system of chaperonage served as a human chastity belt, a living barrier against any potential temptation or indiscretion. Any hint of scandal could have devastating consequences, not just for her but for her entire family, jeopardizing alliances, inheritance, and honor. In the tight-knit peasant villages, the surveillance was less formal but honestly, no less effective. Walls were thin, houses were close together, and privacy was pretty much a foreign concept. The entire village functioned as a collective watchdog. Neighbors, relatives, and busybodies acted as an unpaid network of private investigators, and any whiff of scandal could travel through the community faster than a summer fire. A woman seen talking too long with a man who was not her husband, or a couple disappearing into the woods for a little too long, would become the subject of intense gossip, social shaming, and possibly even official action from the parish priest or village elder. Ultimately, the fear of public shame was one of the most powerful tools for maintaining social order. A woman accused of infidelity could face public penance, such as being paraded through the village, or legal consequences like the loss of her dowry rights. A ruined reputation could make her a social outcast. This system of control was, of course, deeply rooted in the double standards of the time. While a wife's fidelity was a matter of public concern tied to the legitimacy of heirs, a husband's indiscretions were often quietly overlooked. The real guardians of chastity were not made of iron and steel, but of shame, religion, and the watchful eyes of the community. In a surprising twist that would likely shock many of their modern descendants, medieval towns didn't just tolerate the existence of brothels. In many cases, they actively regulated and profited from them. This might seem to clash with the era's powerful religious condemnation of non-procreative sex, but it reveals the deeply pragmatic nature of medieval governance. Across many parts of Europe, especially in bustling urban centers and port cities, brothels operated as legal, licensed businesses. Town councils designated specific streets or districts for these establishments, creating official red light districts long before the invention of the electric light bulb itself. This was not a hidden underground economy, it was a recognized part of the urban landscape. The rationale behind this seemingly contradictory arrangement was a classic example of medieval realpolitik. Civic and even some religious authorities subscribed to the idea of the necessary evil. They believed that men, particularly unmarried men like apprentices, soldiers, and traveling merchants, possessed natural urges that could not be entirely suppressed. If a controlled, regulated outlet for these desires was not provided, officials feared it would lead to far greater social chaos. The alternatives were seen as much worse: an increase in assaults on respectable women, widespread adultery that would disrupt families, or other forms of public disorder. The brothel, therefore, was seen as a kind of social safety valve. This civic management went far beyond simply turning a blind eye. Some cities, particularly in Germany, France, and Italy, took an active role in running these houses. They employed officials, sometimes known by the colorful title brothel keepers or keepers of public women, whose job was to oversee the day-to-day operations. These men were responsible for collecting taxes from the establishments, enforcing local ordinances, and settling disputes. The income generated from licensing fees and taxes on brothels went directly into the municipal treasury, helping to fund public works, pay city guards, or repair town walls. In a very real sense, the wages of sin helped pay for civic improvements. Of course, the church was officially not thrilled with this arrangement. In sermons and theological writings, it consistently condemned prostitution as a grave sin and the entire practice as morally corrupt. However, the unofficial reality on the ground was far more complex and honestly a bit hypocritical. Many local clergy members chose to look the other way, tacitly accepting the town council's pragmatic approach. In some documented cases, bishops or monasteries were the landlords of the very buildings that housed these brothels, quietly collecting rent from the establishments they publicly denounced. This gap between official doctrine and practical application is a perfect illustration of the complex moral landscape of the medieval world. The life of a woman working in a medieval brothel, often called a stew because of its common association with public bathhouses, was certainly no fairy tale. However, it was not always the life of constant, unrelenting misery that we might imagine. The reasons women entered the profession were varied and complex. For some, it was a choice born of economic desperation. Widows without family support, orphans with no inheritance, or women abandoned by their husbands often faced a stark choice between prostitution and starvation. For these women, working in a regulated brothel offered a degree of stability and physical protection that they would not have had on the streets. However, many other women were not there by choice. Coercion and human trafficking were rampant, especially in major port cities where sailors and merchants brought in a constant flow of both coin and complications. Unscrupulous individuals would lure or force young women into the trade, trapping them in a cycle of debt and dependency. The distinction between choice and coercion was often blurry in a world with so few options for women. Once inside the system, leaving was incredibly difficult. Despite this grim reality, the regulated nature of some brothels did offer a sliver of oversight that was absent from its illegal counterpart, creating a strange and precarious form of security. To maintain order and, ostensibly, public health, many municipal brothels operated under a strict set of rules. There were even handbooks, yes, actual handbooks, written for brothel keepers on how their houses should be managed. These regulations often mandated things like the use of clean sheets, basic health inspections for the women, and set operating hours. Some rules forbade the women from leaving the brothel without permission, or from wearing overly ostentatious clothing that might blur the line between them and honorable women. These rules were designed to control the women and contain the trade, keeping it neatly confined to its designated place in society. The patrons of these establishments came from every corner of medieval society, cutting across all social classes. Knights and squires, university students and apprentices, traveling merchants and local craftsmen all frequented the stews. Even monks and priests were known to be customers, despite their vows of celibacy strongly suggesting otherwise. Entry fees varied depending on the reputation of the house, and the services offered were sometimes cataloged. In some cases, particularly in rural areas, customers might not pay with coin but with whatever they had on hand: a few eggs, a measure of wool, or an awkward promise of future goods. It was a commercial transaction, stripped of romance, and integrated into the economic fabric of daily life. Let's set a scene. The candlelight is flickering, a soft breeze rustles through the thatched roof, your beloved whispers sweet nothings in your ear, and then removes their heavy wool tunic to reveal a powerful, unfiltered, medieval musk. This is because when it came to personal hygiene, medieval Europe had its own set of priorities, and smelling like a field of roses was not at the top of the list. Staying clean was certainly a consideration, but it often ranked somewhere below surviving the plague, fixing the leaky roof, and catching the pig that had once again gotten into the pantry. The modern obsession with daily showers and deodorants would have been utterly baffling. Bathing did happen, but not with the frequency or fervor that our modern noses would hope for. For the vast majority of the peasant population, a full-body wash was an infrequent event, perhaps occurring once a month, or more often if they happened to fall into a river by accident. Soap, when available, was either a harsh homemade lye-based concoction or an expensive imported luxury, and it was used sparingly. Public bathhouses did exist in many towns and cities, offering a chance for a hot soak and a scrub. However, these establishments were often viewed with suspicion, associated with prostitution and disease, and were frequently shut down during outbreaks of plague or periods of moral panic. If you were wealthy, you had more and better options for staying clean. A lord or lady could have a hot bath drawn in a portable wooden tub, the water scented with fragrant herbs like lavender, mint, or rosemary. After bathing, they would be dried with soft linen cloths by their attendants. But for the poor, a bath more often involved a quick sponge down with a bucket of cold water and the vague, optimistic hope that their personal aroma would not be too noticeable over the smell of the nearby stables. This was not due to a love of being dirty, but to the sheer difficulty and labor involved in hauling and heating water. To make matters even more complex, water itself was sometimes viewed with suspicion, particularly by medieval physicians. Some medical theories held that bathing, especially in hot water, could open the pores of the skin, making the body vulnerable to disease by letting in bad air or miasmas. Others simply did not have the time, the tub, or access to any water that wasn't already being used by the local geese for their own purposes. Given these conditions, you can begin to imagine the sensory landscape of an intimate encounter. It was an experience grounded in the raw, unmasked realities of the human body. Now imagine trying to impress a potential partner under these fragrant conditions. With bathing being an occasional luxury and deodorant a dream of the distant future, people had to rely on other methods to make themselves attractive. For the elite, perfume was the answer. Imported from the East, expensive scents derived from musk, ambergris and flowers were used to mask body odor. A wealthy lady might dab perfume on her wrists or have her clothes stored with scented sachets. For everyone else, the solutions were more rustic. Chewing on herbs like parsley, mint, or cloves could help freshen the breath, and rubbing aromatic plants on the skin was a common practice. Dental care was a similarly adventurous affair. There were no toothbrushes or fluoride toothpaste. Instead, people might rub their teeth and gums with a rough linen cloth. To whiten their teeth and combat bad breath, they would use abrasive powders made from things like crushed chalk, charcoal, or ash. Sometimes these were mixed with herbs or spices for a better taste. Kissing under these circumstances was certainly an act of faith. A person's breath was a direct reflection of their diet, their health, and whether they had recently been chewing on a sprig of mint or a raw onion. Clothing also played a significant role, but not always a helpful one. People wore layers of wool, linen, and, for the wealthy, fur and silk. These fabrics were not washed frequently and tended to trap heat, sweat, and every single scent encountered throughout the day. This included the smoke from the hearth, the smell of cooking food, the dust from the road, and the ever-present aroma of livestock. Your clothes told a story of your day through scent, and yet despite all this, people still found each other attractive. They still flirted, courted, and fell deeply in love. This suggests that medieval standards of attraction were simply different from our own. Qualities like clear skin, bright eyes, and healthy-looking hair were universally admired as signs of good health and fertility. For women, a pale complexion, a high forehead, often achieved by plucking the hairline, and a slender figure were prized among the nobility. For men, a strong build, a full beard, and signs of martial prowess were considered attractive. Perhaps when everyone smelled equally of wood smoke and humanity, these visual cues became all the more important. Or perhaps love was simply and truly both blind and nose-blind. In medieval Europe, attempting to control the size of your family was a bit like trying to steer a cart with no wheels, no reins, and a particularly uncooperative goat. It was a task that was technically possible to attempt, but not something you could ever count on to succeed. To be perfectly clear, just because contraception was not effective or reliable by our modern standards does not mean that medieval people were oblivious to the connection between sex and pregnancy. They were acutely aware that certain behaviors led to babies, and many individuals went to elaborate, if occasionally baffling, lengths to prevent it from happening when they wished. These early attempts at birth control were a fascinating and often bizarre mix of folk wisdom, herbal medicine, and pure magical thinking. Some of the more quasi-scientific methods involved concocting and consuming herbal mixtures. Plants like pennyroyal, rue, and silphium, which was driven to extinction, possibly due to its popularity, were known for their properties to induce menstruation. Other, more imaginative approaches included drinking wine that had been boiled with beaver testicles, a remedy that was likely more effective at preventing intimacy in the first place. Rituals, such as burying certain symbolic objects near the doorstep or under the bed, were also thought to hold contraceptive power. Alongside these potions and rituals, there were also early attempts at barrier methods, though calling them reliable would be an act of extreme generosity. One common approach involved using pieces of linen or sponges soaked in various concoctions, such as vinegar or lemon juice, which would have had some spermicidal properties. A few brave souls experimented with inserting objects made of wax or other pliable materials. There are even scattered and vague references in some texts to what we might call medieval prototypes of what would later become familiar latex devices, often made from animal intestines or bladders. But it's best not to ask how they were made. You really do not want to know. The Church, of course, was not amused by any of these efforts. Any attempt to deliberately avoid conception was officially labeled as sinful, unnatural, and a frustration of God's will. Procreation was the only stated and legitimate goal of marital relations, and anything that got in the way of that divine mission was frowned upon, condemned from the pulpit, and treated as a serious sin during confession. This created a significant conflict for many people, especially those struggling with poverty, who desperately needed to space out pregnancies or avoid another mouth to feed. The desire for control over their own fertility was a powerful human impulse that persisted despite both theological condemnation and unreliable methods. Despite what stern church authorities and moralizing theologians like to pretend, not every medieval couple waited patiently until the wedding bells rang before getting cozy. The practice of, shall we say, testing the goods before finalizing the marriage contract was common enough to leave a significant mark on the historical record. Known officially as fornication in church court documents and more colloquially as getting ahead of yourself in everyday village gossip. Intimacy before marriage wasn't exactly rare. However, it was most definitely monitored. and it often came with a price, both social and financial if you were caught in the act. Across the towns and parishes of Europe, local ecclesiastical courts kept meticulous moral rolls. These were less like personal diaries and more like ledgers of public shame, recording the transgressions of the community. If a young, unmarried couple was caught or even strongly suspected of jumping the marital timeline, they could be hauled before the local court and fined. Sometimes the fine was paid to the church, sometimes it went into the town's coffers, and occasionally a portion went to the person who claimed to have witnessed the event. It seems medieval snitching was alive, well, and sometimes even profitable for the informant. The severity of the punishment often depended on the circumstances. Fines varied based on whether it was a first offense, whether a pregnancy resulted from the encounter, or whether the couple eventually agreed to get married. In many cases, a promise to marry after the fact was enough to erase or significantly reduce the fine, serving as a kind of retroactive permission slip from the authorities. In other instances, the fine was still applied, but perhaps at a discounted early bird rate. These fines served not only as a punishment but also as a revenue stream for local institutions, turning moral policing into a lucrative business. And let's not forget the powerful social consequences, which were often more daunting than any official fine. In the tight-knit communities of the Middle Ages, everyone knew everyone else's business, and gossip could spread faster than a poorly stored meat pie could spoil in July. So, even if your local priest was feeling particularly merciful, your neighbors might not be. A reputation for being loose could damage a young woman's marriage prospects and bring shame upon her entire family. This social pressure was a constant and powerful force, ensuring that even if couples did indulge, they did so with the utmost secrecy and a healthy dose of fear. In the medieval world, virginity was far more than just a personal virtue or a moral state. It was a commodity. It was a contract clause, a powerful political tool, and at times, a subject of community-wide obsession and scrutiny. Among the peasantry, the expectations surrounding a bride's chastity could vary by region and circumstance. A young woman was generally expected to arrive at her marriage untested, at least officially. But if a premarital pregnancy occurred, some eyebrows would certainly rise, but a hastily arranged shotgun wedding, and perhaps a small fine to the church, could usually sort things out with practicality. For the upper classes, however, the stakes were infinitely higher. For noble and royal women, virginity was not a private matter but a public asset, directly tied to the integrity of bloodlines, the security of inheritance, and the honor of the family name. A broken engagement caused by a whisper of impropriety could spark a diplomatic incident or a violent feud between powerful families. A pregnancy out of wedlock was a dynastic catastrophe, capable of derailing generations of strategic planning. A bride's virginity was the guarantee that her future children were legitimately her husband's, ensuring that titles and lands passed to the correct heir. So how did they verify this all-important status? Well, mostly badly and unreliably. Sometimes proof came down to vague testimony and character references from family and neighbors, with people attesting that she seemed virtuous or that she avoided the stable boy mostly. In more serious cases, more invasive and humiliating methods were employed. Midwives or a panel of experienced matrons might be called upon to conduct a physical inspection, looking for the infamous hymen, which modern science has since confirmed is not, in fact, a reliable medieval chastity barometer. But that scientific reality did not stop anyone at the time. Perhaps the most infamous method of proof was the post-wedding ritual of displaying the blood-stained bedsheet. This served as a very awkward and public Yelp review of the bride's purity. This tradition, while not universal across all of Europe, was expected in certain regions and among certain social classes. The morning after the wedding night, the sheet would be shown to family members as evidence of the consummation and the bride's prior virginity. If the sheet remained inconveniently clean, it could cue lawsuits, demands for the dowry to be returned, messy annulments, and family drama on a scale that would rival any royal soap opera. In medieval Europe, virginity was a public obsession but only for women. Men's premarital experience was rarely questioned. A little worldliness was even admired. No inspections, no panels, no proof required for grooms, while women's purity was scrutinized, legislated, and tied to family honor. Virginity was a woman's social currency, her worth and her family's future riding on it. If a bride's past was revealed, the fallout could destroy reputations and alliances. For women, the pressure to preserve and prove virginity was immense, while men faced almost none. Same-sex attraction absolutely existed in the medieval world, but it was fraught with risk. The church condemned it as a grave sin, lumping it under sodomy, a term covering everything from non-procreative acts to excessive dancing. Punishments varied wildly, but social status often determined your fate. Yet, love letters between monks, devoted noblewomen, and intense bonds in monasteries and convents show these relationships existed, if hidden. There was no concept of coming out. Feelings were coded in poetry, glances, and allegory. The idea of fixed sexual identity didn't exist. People simply lived carefully, quietly. Even in a world of strict rules, human connection found a way. Adultery in medieval Europe was a high-risk gamble, especially for women. For wives, discovery meant public shaming, loss of property, exile, or lifelong confinement. Men faced fewer consequences, unless they slept with another man's wife, risking violence or deadly feuds. Adultery threatened inheritance, alliances, and family honor, making it a public crisis, not just a private affair. Among nobles, scandals could spark duels or ruin dynasties. For peasants, it meant fines and endless gossip. The double standard was clear. Women bore the brunt, men often walked away. In the end, adultery was less about love and more about power, property, and reputation. Consent in medieval marriage was complicated, legally required but rarely freely given. The church said both parties must agree, but family interests usually decided matches, especially for noblewomen. Refusing a family-arranged marriage could mean social ruin. For peasants, saying no risked poverty or isolation. Power imbalances made true consent elusive, especially when pressured by family or local authorities. Courtly love tales celebrated romantic choice, but real women had little say. In practice, consent was more theory than reality. After marriage, the idea of consent faded. Spouses owed each other the marital debt, meaning sex was a duty, not a choice. Denying a husband could be grounds for confession or annulment. Ongoing consent wasn't expected. The law assumed permanent access, though the church urged moderation. Women had little legal recourse, but extreme cruelty could sometimes be punished in church courts. Still, not all marriages were cold contracts. Many couples found affection and mutual respect beyond the rules. Legal texts don't capture the full reality. Love and partnership often thrived despite doctrine. The human heart found ways to bend the rules. Despite rigid rules and constant scrutiny, love survived in medieval Europe. Peasants courted in fields and markets, building bonds through small acts and shared moments. Nobles exchanged secret glances and poetry, finding passion amid political marriages. Even in monasteries and convents, letters revealed deep emotional longing, sometimes spiritual, sometimes more. Courtly love stories and troubadour songs show a culture obsessed with romance, even when it was forbidden or impossible. Against all odds, the desire for connection endured, proving the human heart always finds a way. The medieval world was a place of profound and often baffling contradictions, and nowhere is this more apparent than in its approach to sex and relationships. It was an era that produced some of the most romantic and chivalrous literature in history, while simultaneously treating marriage as a cold, hard business transaction. It was a society that officially condemned all non-procreative intimacy as sinful, yet allowed for the operation of regulated, tax-paying brothels in the heart of its cities. This was a world where the church preached the virtues of modesty and restraint, while its own confession manuals delved into the most explicit and intimate details of parishioners' lives. This landscape of paradoxes forced people to live in a state of constant negotiation between doctrine and desire, between public expectation and private reality. A couple might listen dutifully to a sermon on the sin of lust on Sunday morning, and then go home to their shared straw mattress and find comfort, solace, and pleasure in each other's arms. They learned to navigate the complex rules, perhaps confessing their excessive affection with a sense of dutiful guilt, while never truly believing that the love they shared was something to be ashamed of. This ability to hold two conflicting ideas at once was essential for survival. The physical realities of life also stood in stark contrast to the romantic ideals. Knights pledged to perform heroic deeds for their ladies, but everyone, knight and lady alike, lived in a world of questionable sanitation, rampant disease, and pervasive smells. The grand gestures of courtly love were performed against a backdrop of mud, smoke, and hardship. This did not diminish the feelings involved, rather, it grounded them. Love had to be resilient enough to look past the unwashed hair and the less-than-fresh breath, and to find beauty and connection in the imperfect, authentic human being standing before them. Ultimately, the story of medieval sex is not a simple tale of repression. It is a story of human resilience and adaptation. People found ways to love, to desire, and to connect within the framework they were given. They used poetry, song, and coded language to express what could not be said openly. They carved out moments of privacy in a world that offered none. They balanced their fear of God with their need for each other. It was a world of complex, messy, and deeply human compromises, where the official rules were only ever half of the story. As we conclude our exploration, it's tempting to view the medieval world as a distant and bizarre place, a dark age of strange beliefs and uncomfortable living conditions. We can laugh at the thought of beaver testicle wine as a contraceptive or shake our heads at the awkwardness of a supervised courtship. It's easy to feel a sense of smug superiority from our modern vantage point, with our private bedrooms, advanced medicine, and a far more open understanding of human sexuality. Yet, if we look closely, we can see the echoes of the medieval world in our own lives and societies even today. The tensions between religious doctrine and personal freedom, between social expectation and individual desire, have certainly not vanished. Debates over contraception, the definition of marriage, and the role of pleasure in relationships continue to be prominent features of our modern cultural landscape. The double standards that place the burden of purity on women while largely excusing men still linger in subtle and not-so-subtle ways. Gossip and social media have become our new village square, a place where reputations can be made or destroyed with breathtaking speed, the modern equivalent of public shaming. The fundamental human experiences also remain unchanged. We still seek love and connection. We still grapple with jealousy and heartbreak, and we still navigate the complexities of building a life with another person. The need for intimacy, for both physical and emotional connection, is as powerful now as it was 1,000 years ago. The desire to find a partner, to build a family, and to feel a sense of belonging is a thread that connects us directly to the peasant couple huddled for warmth on their straw mattress, and the noble lady exchanging secret letters with her beloved knight. By studying their world, we gain a deeper appreciation for our own. We see how far we've come in terms of privacy, hygiene, and personal freedom. But we're also reminded that the core of the human experience is timeless. The people of the Middle Ages were not so different from us. They lived, they worked, they feared, and they loved with all the passion and complexity they could muster. Their story is a powerful reminder that in any era, under any set of rules, the human heart will always seek out its own truth, finding love, joy, and connection in spite of